When you hear the name Richard Nixon, what comes to mind? For a lot of people, it's a mix of truly incredible achievements and, well, unprecedented scandal. He was a political giant who opened up relations with China, but he was also the only U.S. president to ever resign in disgrace. So how can one man embody such a massive contradiction? That's what we're going to dig into.
This one question from historian James McGregor Burns just completely nails it. How can one evaluate such an idiosyncratic president, so brilliant and so morally lacking? That's the whole story right there. It's this paradox of brilliance and moral failure, of huge vision and deep, deep paranoia that really defined his entire life and career.
So yeah, we're talking about a man of staggering contradictions. This was a president who pulled off things his predecessors could only dream about. And yet, he's the only one in American history to leave office in shame. How did one person manage to be both of those things at the same time? Okay, so to really get a handle on the man, you gotta look at where he came from. Richard Nixon was born into a poor Quaker family down in Southern California. His early life was tough, marked by hardship, which seems to have forged this relentless, almost obsessive drive in him to succeed no matter the odds. And his political rise was, well, it was meteoric. Congressman, then senator, then vice president, all in just 6 years. But what's really amazing is his resilience. After losing the presidency to JFK in 1960 by a razor-thin margin, and then losing the California governor's race 2 years later, he famously told reporters, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore." Sounds like the end, right? Well, just 6 years after that, he was in the White House. Early on, he really made a name for himself as this fierce anti-communist. It was his relentless pursuit of Alger Hiss, a former State Department official accused of being a Soviet spy, that really put him on the map nationally. It pretty much defined his political identity for years. And you have to remember, he was a total master of this new medium called television. Back in 1952, a scandal about a political fund almost got him kicked off the ticket with Eisenhower. So what does he do? He goes on national TV and gives the now legendary Checkers speech. He talks about his wife's respectable Republican cloth coat and, famously, the family dog, Checkers. The public absolutely loved it. It saved his career, just like that.
So he finally gets to the Oval Office, and you'd think things would get clearer, right? No, the paradox of Richard Nixon only got deeper. Because for all the darkness that would come later, his administration pulled off a string of truly historic and, frankly, often surprising accomplishments. Let's start with the big one, his visit to China in 1972. I mean, this was an absolutely mind-blowing diplomatic move. For more than 20 years, the U.S. had pretended the communist government in China didn't exist. Nixon's visit completely shattered that isolation, reshaped the entire Cold War, and kicked off a whole new era in global politics. And he didn't stop there. He then turned his attention to the other communist superpower, the Soviet Union. This policy, called détente, was all about easing tensions. It led to huge arms control agreements, like the SALT I and anti-ballistic missile treaties. It was a genuine effort to pull the world back from the brink of nuclear war.
And then, of course, there was the elephant in the room, Vietnam. Nixon had run for president promising peace with honor. And through a tough combination of military force and intense diplomacy, his administration did negotiate the Paris Peace Accords in 1973, which finally ended America's direct involvement in that incredibly long and painful war. Okay, but here's where it gets really surprising for a lot of people: his domestic record. The same guy, this tough-on-crime, anti-communist hardliner, created the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. He signed the Clean Air Act and the Endangered Species Act. He founded OSHA to protect worker safety. It's a list of achievements that makes him incredibly difficult to just stick a simple political label on. In his very first inaugural address, he said this: he truly saw his legacy as being a peacemaker on the world stage. And for a while there, it really looked like he was pulling it off. But there was a whole other side to him, a darker side, that was already bubbling right under the surface, ready to unravel everything.
And that, of course, brings us to Watergate. It's a single word that has come to mean so much more than just a hotel. It represents the spectacular downfall of a president, and for many, a moment when faith in the American government was shattered.
And this is where you really see those two Nixons side by side in the starkest possible terms. On one hand, you have the global statesman ending the Vietnam War. And on the other, you have the paranoid politician completely obsessed with his enemies and willing to authorize illegal, dirty tricks against them.
It was this dark, paranoid side that led directly to the break-in.
So how did it all go down? Well, it unfolded in stages. First, you have the actual break-in, which the White House at first just dismissed as a third-rate burglary. But the real crime, the one that brought everything down, was the cover-up. Then came the bombshell, the revelation of a secret taping system in the Oval Office. The fight over those tapes went all the way to the Supreme Court, and that led to the final, inevitable step, resignation. As the walls started closing in, Nixon went on TV and delivered one of the most famous, or infamous, lines in political history. "I'm not a crook." He was defiant to the end, but the tapes would tell a very different story. That quote became an unforgettable symbol of the whole scandal. This was the final blow, the nail in the coffin. The Supreme Court, unanimously by the way, ordered him to turn over the tapes. And one of them, the smoking gun tape, was undeniable proof. It caught Nixon on tape approving a plan to use the CIA to block the FBI's investigation, just days after the break-in. It was over. Facing certain impeachment, he had no choice but to resign. So after all that, we're left with this massive question about his legacy. I mean, how do you even begin to balance the scales of a presidency with such incredible highs and such devastating, earth-shattering lows? And you know, he never actually faced criminal charges for any of this. Just a month after he resigned, his successor, President Gerald Ford, gave him a full pardon. It was a hugely controversial decision at the time, but Ford argued it was the only way for the nation to heal and finally move on. But here's that Nixon resilience one last time. In what you could call his final act, he spent the last 20 years of his life working tirelessly to repair his reputation. He wrote book after book on foreign policy and became this sort of unofficial advisor to future presidents. He basically tried to reinvent himself as an elder statesman. Which brings us right back to where we started. So how should history judge Richard Nixon? Was he a brilliant, visionary peacemaker who was just consumed and destroyed by his own personal demons, or was he a corrupt politician whose crimes completely overshadowed any good he ever accomplished? Honestly, the debate is still raging today, which leaves him as maybe the most brilliant, most tragic, and most contradictory figure in modern American history.